young genetic genealogist from New Jersey played a huge part in identifying Marise's killer. At 20 years old, he's just a junior in college.
A 9-year-old girl left her house on a Wednesday morning carrying lunchboxes for her teachers. She was thoughtful like that, kind in small, quiet ways. She had less than half a mile to walk. Streets she had taken dozens of times. Neighbors she recognized. A school she loved. She never arrived. And the man who took her life that morning went on to live in the same city as her grieving family for 16 more years. Completely untouched, completely unknown, never once questioned. Until a college student sitting at home during a pandemic sent a single email that cracked open 58 years of silence. This is the story of Marise Ann Chivarella. And before we go any further, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now, like this video, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. We cover the cases that deserve to be remembered, and this one is unlike anything we have ever told. Stay with us. Hazleton, Pennsylvania in March of 1964 was a working-class coal mining city in the eastern part of the state, roughly 80 miles north of Philadelphia. Anthracite coal had built this city from the ground up. Immigrant families, Slovak, Italian, Irish, had been pouring into this region since the late 1800s, building their communities around Catholic churches and parochial schools, raising their children in neighborhoods where everybody knew everybody. It was the kind of place where you sent your kids to school on foot and never gave it a second thought. Because why would you? These were your streets. These were your neighbors. This was your home. America in late 1963 was still raw from the assassination of President Kennedy. The whole country was in mourning. But in Hazleton, daily life moved at its familiar rhythm. Shift work at the mines and the factories. Dinner with the family every evening. Mass on Sunday morning. Life continued the way it always had in a place like this. Marise Ann Chivarella was 9 years old. She was a third-grade student at St. Joseph's Parochial School, the heart of the Slovak-American Catholic community in Hazleton. She lived less than half a mile from that school, along residential streets she had walked countless times before. Her family, her parents, and 5 children total, lived in a close, crowded neighborhood the way most families did in that part of Pennsylvania. Marise was the kind of child who showed her love in small gestures. Quietly, thoughtfully, without being asked. On the morning of March 18, 1964, she left home at around 8:10 in the morning. She was carrying lunchboxes, gifts she had prepared to give to her teachers. Her family watched her walk out the front door. They had no reason to worry. She had made that walk so many times before. That was the last time they ever saw her alive. Somewhere on that short and familiar route, a man took her. He abducted her. He raped her. He strangled her to death. And then he put her body into a vehicle and drove more than 2 miles to an abandoned coal mine pit on the outskirts of Hazleton, where he left her at the bottom and walked away. All of this happened in broad daylight, in a city of neighbors, between 8:10 in the morning and 1 o'clock in the afternoon, with not a single witness coming forward who had seen anything. At around 1 in the afternoon, a man teaching his 16-year-old grandson how to drive on the outskirts of town pulled over near an abandoned coal pit. He looked down into it. He saw something that made him immediately call the police. What the Pennsylvania State Police found at the bottom of that coal mine pit confirmed every fear the Chivarella family had been carrying since Marise's teacher called home that morning to ask why she had not shown up to class. Marise Ann Chivarella, 9 years old, had been raped and strangled. The cause of death was asphyxiation due to strangulation combined with sexual assault. Her body had been driven more than 2 miles from where she was taken and left in that abandoned pit. The lunchboxes she had been carrying for her teachers were found lying beside her. That same afternoon, investigators collected biological evidence from her coat and clothing. The attacker's semen was found and carefully preserved according to the standard forensic procedures of 1964. And that is where the first wall appeared. Because what forensic science could do in 1964 was extremely limited. Investigators could determine a blood type from biological evidence. They could narrow down a pool of suspects in the broadest possible way. But a personal DNA profile? A comparison against a national database? Completely unimaginable. The evidence was cataloged, logged, and placed into storage, waiting for a future that nobody in that room could predict. The Pennsylvania State Police opened their investigation on March 18, 1964, and they did not treat it lightly for a single day. A child had been abducted and murdered in broad daylight on her way to school. The entire community was shaken in a way that changed how people in Hazleton understood their own safety. Investigators spread out across the neighborhood immediately. They interviewed everyone who lived or worked near the route Marise had walked. They questioned every driver who had passed through that area between 8 and 9 that morning. They tracked every man in the region with any suspicious history whatsoever. They cross-referenced blood types against the biological evidence from the scene. Suspects were identified and eliminated one by one. This one had a confirmed alibi. That one had the wrong blood type. Another had no physical opportunity. No name held up through all the checks. And here is the detail that would haunt this case for the next 58 years. James Paul Forte, a 22-year-old bartender who lived just 6 blocks from where Marise disappeared, whose blood type matched the evidence, and who had no confirmed alibi for that morning, was never interviewed during the initial investigation. No one knocked on his door. No one sat across from him and asked where he was on the morning of March 18, 1964. His name simply never appeared in those first critical weeks and months. 6 blocks away. Never asked. The investigation stretched forward. Through the 1970s. Through the 1980s. Through the 1990s. Each decade brought new forensic technology, and each time that happened, the MARISE Chivarella file was pulled back out and reviewed with new tools and fresh eyes. Improved blood type analysis, protein electrophoresis, and eventually DNA. More than 230 Pennsylvania State Police members would work on this case at various points across those decades. More than 4,000 pages of documents were compiled. Interview reports, investigative notes, suspect files, test results, all the accumulated evidence of a pursuit that never ended. The Pennsylvania State Police had existed for 117 years as of 2022. More than half of that institutional history had touched this one case. And not once in 58 years, did they close the file. In 2007, DNA technology had finally reached the point where something that would have seemed like science fiction in 1964 became possible. Forensic scientists at the Pennsylvania State Police DNA lab took the biological evidence that had been sitting in storage since March 18, 1964, preserved across 43 years, and from it, they constructed a complete, full personal DNA profile of Marise's killer. That profile was uploaded immediately to CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. No match. Marise's killer had never been convicted of a felony in the United States. His DNA was not in the system. It had never entered any forensic database, not during his lifetime and not after his death. For the next 15 years, that DNA profile was checked against CODIS every single month. 180 consecutive checks across 15 consecutive years. Nothing. Every single month, nothing. They had a complete and accurate DNA profile of a killer. They simply had no name to put to it. If you are still with us at this point, drop a comment right now that says, "I'm still here." Let's see who is truly following this story, because what happens next is something nobody in that investigation could have seen coming. Through every one of those years without an answer, Carmen Marie Radicki was living with the weight of March 18th, 1964. Carmen was Marissa's younger sister, one of 4 surviving siblings. The Chivarella family had been given the worst confirmation almost immediately. There was no prolonged period of hoping Marisse might still be alive somewhere. That hope was destroyed before the sun went down on the day she disappeared. What the family did not know, and would not know for 58 years, was who. There was no name, no face, no person who could be made to stand in a courtroom and answer for what happened on that road. Carmen grew up carrying her sister's memory and a question that had no answer. Who did this? Where is that person now? The family stayed in contact with the Pennsylvania State Police across the decades. They received updates when new technology was applied. They followed every development. In 2019, investigators partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, the company that developed technology to generate predicted facial images directly from DNA, and created 3 composite sketches of the suspect. What he might have looked like at 25 years old, at 40, at 60, reconstructed entirely from the genetic material in the 1964 biological evidence. The images were released publicly in March of 2019. A white male with dark hair and a broad nose. Tips poured in from the community. People thought of neighbors, former co-workers, men they had known in Hazleton decades earlier. Every tip was followed. None led anywhere. James Paul Forte had been dead since 1980. He had been gone for nearly 40 years by the time those sketches were released, and no one in his former circle made the connection. But the Parabon sketches did something that no previous method had managed to do. They brought Marisse Chivarella's story back into wide public attention. Pennsylvania media covered it. Cold case communities shared it online. And through that reach, the story of a 9-year-old girl from Hazleton traveled far enough to land in front of a college student sitting at home during a pandemic who had never heard her name before that moment. Eric Schubert had started building family trees when he was 10 years old. By the time the pandemic forced everyone indoors, he was a junior history major at Elizabethtown College in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. He had spent years helping adoptees and donor-conceived people find their biological families through genetic genealogy work. He was 18 years old and sitting at home when he read about the Marisse Chivarella case for the first time. He later described what he felt when he read it. He said he just read about how horrific and disgusting the crime was, and it really hit him, and he knew that if he could help, he really wanted to. So he sent an email to the Pennsylvania State Police. He introduced himself as a college student with genetic genealogy skills who had read about the Marisse Chivarella case, and asked whether he would be interfering with anyone's work if he offered to help. Trooper Petrosky, who received that email, later reflected on what it meant to say yes to something that far outside the usual boundaries of a state police investigation. He said that Schubert had emailed requesting to work on the case, and that for the Pennsylvania State Police, that was a little outside the norm, but that the decision had been rewarded. The killer's DNA profile was uploaded to GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, public genealogy databases where ordinary people voluntarily upload their own DNA to find relatives, without knowing that their genetic information might one day help identify a murderer in their family tree. The first match that came back was extraordinarily distant. A possible 6th cousin of the killer. Someone who shared just enough DNA with him to register as a match in the database, but nowhere near close enough to identify him directly. From that single, distant, fragile starting point, Eric Schubert began building outward. Birth records, marriage records, death records, census records, local newspaper archives. The scattered fragments of documentation that exist in public archives across generations, which, when assembled correctly, branch by branch and name by name, can eventually collapse an enormous family tree down to a single individual. Schubert described the work honestly. He said it was probably the hardest genealogy task he had ever faced, probably the hardest thing he had ever done in his entire life. He worked on it for 2 years, from 18 years old to 20 years old, a college student voluntarily pouring year after year into a case that 230 professional investigators across 58 years had been unable to close. And then, from that painstakingly constructed family tree, one name rose to the surface. James Paul Forte, the 22-year-old bartender from Hazleton. The man who had lived 6 blocks from where Maris disappeared on the morning of March 18, 1964. The man whose blood type had matched the evidence back in 1964. The man no one had ever knocked on the door of and asked the right questions. The man who had a prior charge of violent sexual assault against a surviving victim. Proof that what happened to Maris was not a single isolated act of violence, but part of a pattern that had existed before her and might have continued after her if she had survived. The man who went on living in Hazleton, in the same city as the family he had shattered, for 16 years after killing her, until he died of natural causes in May of 1980 at the age of 38. His DNA had never entered any database. He had lived his whole life and died in his bed, without ever being held to account for what he did to a 9-year-old girl on her way to school. Schubert's family tree had pointed directly at Forte, but the Pennsylvania State Police still needed absolute scientific confirmation, and there was only one way to get it. In January of 2022, they exhumed the body of James Paul Forte. Samples were taken from his remains and sent to the laboratory for comparison against the DNA profile that had been built in 2007 from biological evidence collected and preserved on March 18, 1964. On February 3, 2022, the results came back. The DNA from James Paul Forte's exhumed remains was an exact match to the DNA from Maris and Chivarella's clothing. The Pennsylvania State Police put the statistical weight of that confirmation into terms that could be understood. They explained that roughly 117 billion people have ever lived on Earth across all of human history. To find another individual who matched that DNA profile, you would need to search the population of more than 4 million versions of planet Earth. This was not a probability. This was not reasonable doubt. This was absolute, irrefutable confirmation. On February 10, 2022, the Pennsylvania State Police held a press conference in Hazleton. The room was packed, not just with media, but with current and retired investigators from multiple generations. Among them stood the very first officer who had worked the Maris Chivarella case back in 1964. Still alive, standing in that room, hearing the answer that the investigation he had started could never complete on its own. Also in that room, Marissa's 4 surviving siblings, her extended family, and Eric Schubert, 20 years old, standing alongside career law enforcement officers as a colleague and equal. A college student, standing there because an email he sent at 18 years old had done what 58 years and 230 professionals could not. Corporal Mark Barron, the lead investigator, spoke to the press with words that carried every one of those 58 years inside them. He said it was a very important day for the agency. He said that even though it had taken nearly 58 years, this should give hope to victims' families across the state and across the country. Hope that no matter how long it takes, they as a law enforcement agency will never give up. He closed with 7 words that said everything. In life or in death, you will be found. And Carmen Marie Radicki, Marissa's little sister, who had grown up without her for 58 years, who had carried that question without an answer for more than half a century, stood in front of the cameras and said that her family had so many precious memories of Marisse, and that at the same time, they would always feel the emptiness and sadness of her absence. She said her family now knew the identity of her killer. She said justice had been served that day. The Marisse and Chivarella case was solved because every single piece had to fall into place across 58 years, and eventually, and probably, it did. Biological evidence collected and preserved correctly by investigators following procedure on the worst day of one family's life. A DNA profile finally built in 2007 when the technology existed to read what 1964 could not. 15 consecutive years of monthly database checks, never skipped, by a force that refused to let the case go cold. A public release in 2019 that spread the story wide enough to reach one specific college student sitting at home during a pandemic. That student's decision to send one email. And 2 years of the hardest genealogy work of his life. One email. That is what it came down to in the end. If you have a family member who is a victim in an unsolved cold case with biological evidence collected at the scene, contact the investigating agency and ask 2 specific questions. Is the biological evidence still preserved? And has the DNA profile been submitted to GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA for genetic genealogy investigation? Codes can only match a suspect whose DNA is already in the system. Genetic genealogy can find a suspect through distant relatives, even if that suspect was never convicted of anything, even if they have been dead for decades. This case was unsolvable through codes for 15 straight years. Genetic genealogy. Marisse and Chivarella was 9 years old. She left home on a Wednesday morning carrying lunchboxes for her teachers because that was the kind of child she was. She deserved to make it to school that day. She deserved 58 more years. Her family deserved answers long before 2022. And the man who took all of that from them lived freely in the same city for 16 years before dying in his sleep, never once held responsible. He thought he had gotten away with it. He was wrong. It just took 58 years, 230 investigators, for 1,000 pages of documents, a 20-year-old college student, and 1 email to prove it. That is the power of never giving up. If this story moved you, if Marissa's name deserves to stay with you, like this video right now, leave a comment below and subscribe to Truecrime Exposed. Every case we cover is a name that deserves to be remembered. Every victim deserves to have their story told. We will see you in the next one.